The iron gates at 700 Nimes Road stood closed against the March darkness. Beyond them, past the hedgerows that had grown thick over 3 decades, the house waited in silence. It was a Wednesday night in 2011, and the lights inside burned low, as they often did now. The woman who had lived here longer than anywhere else, longer than the houses in London, longer than the chalets in Switzerland, longer than the estates shared with 7 different husbands, was not home. She had not been home for weeks. Elizabeth Taylor lay 40 minutes away, in a private suite at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The congestive heart failure that had been slowly claiming her body had entered its final stage. Doctors measured what remained in hours, perhaps days. Outside the hospital, photographers gathered with telephoto lenses, waiting for the shot that would mark the end of something larger than any single life. Inside the estate on Nimes Road, staff moved through rooms that had become a kind of museum to a woman who was still technically alive. The official statements released to the press spoke of a peaceful decline, a legend surrounded by family, her 4 children gathered close. The narrative was clean and suitable for morning broadcasts. But the house itself told a different story, one written in prescription bottles, arranged on nightstands, in the wheelchair ramps installed years earlier, in the hospital bed that had replaced the canopied one in the master bedroom. The woman who had once been called the most beautiful in the world had spent her final years in this house, navigating a body that had become a prison, its corridors marked by pain. She had purchased the property in 1981, shortly after her 7th marriage, to Larry Fortensky. No, that would come later. In 1981, she was between her 6th and 7th husbands. Between John Warner and the construction worker she would meet at the Betty Ford Center. The house was hers alone then, a rare thing. For most of her adult life, Elizabeth Taylor had moved through residences that belonged to marriages, addresses that changed with wedding rings. This house on Nimes Road was different. She chose it for herself, and she would die owning it. The structure itself was unremarkable by Bel Air standards. A ranch-style home, single-story, built in 1958. Its value lay not in architectural distinction, but in privacy. Set back from the road, obscured by mature landscaping, it offered something Taylor had rarely possessed: invisibility. Here, behind walls covered in yellow climbing roses, she could exist without the camera's constant presence. Here, the public Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed goddess, the husband collector, the scandal magnet, could retreat, and something more complicated could emerge. What emerged, over 30 years, was a woman increasingly defined by physical suffering. The back injuries from film sets, the surgeries, more than 30 by some counts, the hip replacements, the brain tumor removed in 1997, the osteoporosis that bent her spine, the skin cancer, the pneumonia that recurred like a seasonal guest. Each ailment left its mark on the house: the medical equipment that accumulated in spare rooms, the nurses' quarters established where guest suites had been, the pharmacy's worth of medications organized with clinical precision. And there were the other dependencies, the ones spoken of in careful euphemisms. The years at Betty Ford, twice publicly, some whispered more often privately. The painkillers prescribed after each surgery that proved difficult to relinquish, the sleeping pills, the anti-anxiety medications, the cocktail of substances that allowed her to function, then didn't, then did again. The house on Nimes Road witnessed all of it: the interventions, the recoveries, the relapses, the quiet negotiations between a body in pain and a mind seeking relief. By 2011, the estate had become less a home than a hospice. Visitors who came to pay respects in her final years described a woman still imperious, still capable of flashing wit, but visibly diminished. She received guests propped on pillows. her famous face swollen from medications, her body wrapped in caftans that disguised its frailty. The jewelry remained. She was never without significant pieces, but it now seemed to wear her rather than the reverse. Diamonds and emeralds on fingers grown thin, sapphires around a neck that could no longer fully support itself. The night of March 22nd passed into the morning of March 23rd. At Cedars-Sinai, the family maintained its vigil. At Nimes Road, the house held its breath. At 1:28 in the morning, Elizabeth Taylor's heart, that organ she had given away so many times in marriage, in performance, in public confession, finally stopped. The news broke within hours. Obituaries that had been written and revised for years were finally published. The house on Nimes Road became, briefly, a site of pilgrimage. Fans left flowers at the gate. Television cameras established positions across the street. The privacy the estate had provided for 3 decades evaporated in the glare of her death, just as it had always evaporated when her life became too interesting to ignore. She was born in London in 1932 to American parents whose ambitions would shape everything that followed. Frances Taylor sold art to wealthy collectors. Sarah Southern had abandoned a modest stage career for marriage. When war threatened Europe in 1939, the family relocated to Los Angeles, where Frances opened a gallery in the Beverly Hills Hotel. It was there, among the wealthy and the famous who came to browse paintings, that the trajectory of their daughter's life was set. The child Elizabeth possessed something that could not be taught or purchased. Studio scouts who encountered her spoke of the eyes first, an apparent violet hue, framed by a genetic anomaly called distichiasis, that gave her a double row of eyelashes. The combination was arresting, almost unnatural. By the age of 9, she had signed with Universal Pictures. By 10, she was at MGM, the studio that would control her adolescence with contractual precision. The system that created Elizabeth Taylor was designed for maximum extraction. Child stars were investments, their development managed like agricultural products. She was tutored on the lot between takes, her education subordinated to shooting schedules. Her weight was monitored, her appearance scrutinized, her public statements scripted. Sarah Taylor, the former actress, became her daughter's constant companion on set, a stage mother whose influence would later be described in terms ranging from devoted to suffocating. What emerged from this machinery was a performer of genuine ability, trapped in an image of manufactured perfection. Films like National Velvet, released when she was 12, established her as America's idealized daughter. The publicity department crafted narratives of wholesome girlhood, while the reality involved 16-hour workdays and adult pressures applied to a child's psychology. The dissociation between public image and private experience began early and never fully resolved. Adolescence brought physical transformation that the studio exploited immediately. At 16, Elizabeth Taylor possessed a woman's body and a child's legal status. MGM extended her contract and increased her workload. The films grew more adult in theme. A Place in the Sun, in which she played opposite Montgomery Clift, presented her as an object of mature desire. She was 18 during filming, navigating complex emotional scenes while simultaneously navigating the studio's control over her romantic life. Her first marriage at 18 followed a pattern that would repeat with variations for decades. Conrad Hilton Jr., heir to the hotel fortune, represented an escape from MGM's authority, or seemed to. The wedding was a studio production in itself, covered by newsreels and magazines. The dress designed to maximize photographic impact. The marriage lasted 8 months. Taylor later described Hilton as abusive, alcoholic, and unfaithful. She did not describe her own behavior during those months, maintaining a selective silence that would characterize her public discussion of private matters throughout her life. The second husband, Michael Wilding, was 20 years her senior, a British actor whose calm demeanour seemed to offer stability. 2 sons were born during this marriage, Michael and Christopher, but stability proved insufficient. Taylor's career was ascending, while Wilding's declined, and the resulting tension corroded whatever foundation they had established. By 1957, they had divorced, and she had already moved on to her third husband. Mike Todd was something different. A producer of flamboyant confidence and considerable wealth, he matched Taylor's appetite for excess. The jewelry began in earnest during this marriage, the diamonds and rubies that would become her signature, gifts that served simultaneously as expressions of love and assertions of ownership. Todd was possessive and generous, volatile and adoring. Taylor, by her own account, was deeply in love. Their daughter Liza was born in 1957. 13 months after their wedding, Mike Todd boarded a private plane named the Lucky Liz, bound for New York despite dangerous weather. Elizabeth remained in Los Angeles, too ill with bronchitis to travel. The plane crashed in New Mexico, killing everyone aboard. Taylor learned of her husband's death from a phone call. She was 26 years old, a widow, a mother of 3, and one of the most famous women in the world. The grief that followed was genuine, but it was also public, performed on television, captured in photographs, narrated in magazines. Taylor's mourning became content, her tears a commodity, and it was during this mourning that the scandal which would define her public image began to take shape. Eddie Fisher, Todd's best friend, had come to comfort the widow. He was married to Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart. Within months, the comfort had become an affair, and the affair had become a sensation. The response was extraordinary. Taylor received death threats. She was denounced from pulpits. Exhibitors refused to show her films. The narrative of the husband-stealing temptress, a narrative that would prove remarkably durable, was established. What the public condemnation missed, or chose to ignore, was the complexity beneath the scandal. A young woman whose emotional development had been arrested by studio control, whose capacity for attachment had been warped by constant performance, whose need for love had become indistinguishable from her need for drama. She married Fisher in 1959. The marriage was troubled from its inception, overshadowed by the ghost of Mike Todd, and by Taylor's growing recognition that Fisher was not the man his friend had been. It would last 5 years on paper, though it was effectively over much sooner. What ended it was not gradual dissolution, but a sudden overwhelming force named Richard Burton. They met on the set of Cleopatra in Rome, 1962. The production had already become legendary for its chaos, a budget spiraling beyond control, a director replaced, Taylor herself nearly dying from pneumonia and requiring an emergency tracheotomy that left a scar she would carry for life. Into this atmosphere of crisis and excess came Richard Burton, a Welsh actor of classical training and considerable reputation, married to his first wife, father to 2 children. Within weeks the affair had begun. Within months, it had become the most publicized romance of the 20th century. The paparazzi who descended on Rome established techniques that would define celebrity journalism for decades. Photographers scaled walls, bribed hotel staff, chartered boats to capture images of the couple. The Vatican issued a public condemnation, calling Taylor an erotic vagrant. Burton's wife flew to Rome to confront him. The confrontation was photographed. Eddie Fisher issued statements of devotion that became increasingly pathetic as the affair's permanence became clear. The world watched, and Elizabeth Taylor, already notorious, became something else entirely, a symbol of desire unbound by convention. What the photographs could not capture was the nature of the connection between them. Burton was, by all accounts, her intellectual superior, widely read, Welsh chapel eloquent, capable of reciting Shakespeare and Dylan Thomas from memory. Taylor had been educated on studio lots, her reading largely confined to scripts. Yet something in their pairing worked, at least initially. He called her his ocean. She called him her everything. The letters they exchanged, later published, reveal an intensity that transcended their public performances of passion. They married in 1964, divorced in 1974, remarried in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. The arithmetic of their relationship, 2 marriages, 2 divorces, spanning 14 years, fails to convey its consuming nature. During their years together, they acquired properties around the world: the chalet in Gstaad, the casa in Puerto Vallarta, suites maintained permanently at the Dorchester in London. They traveled with an entourage that sometimes numbered 30. They drank, prodigiously, competitively, destructively. They fought in public and reconciled in public, their marriage a continuous performance witnessed by millions. The jewelry accumulated during the Burton years became its own legend. The Krupp diamond, 33 carats, purchased at auction for over $300,000. The Taylor Burton diamond, nearly 70 carats, briefly the most expensive diamond in the world. The Bulgari emerald suite, the La Peregrina pearl, once owned by Spanish royalty. Taylor wore these pieces not merely as adornment, but as armor, as evidence, as proof of something she seemed perpetually to require proof of. Burton gave them, she kept them. When the marriages ended, the jewelry remained hers. But the body that displayed these treasures was already failing. The back problems that had begun in her 20s worsened throughout the Burton years. She gained and lost weight dramatically, her figure fluctuating with medications, with emotional states, with the demands of roles she increasingly had difficulty performing. The drinking contributed to accidents, falls, injuries that required hospitalization, incidents that were explained to the press as minor mishaps. The pattern of physical crisis followed by medical intervention, followed by pharmaceutical management, was establishing itself. Burton, meanwhile, was conducting his own negotiations with alcohol and mortality. His drinking matched, and sometimes exceeded hers. His body too was deteriorating, the liver damage that would eventually contribute to his death already progressing. Together, they enabled each other's worst tendencies, while simultaneously providing each other's greatest source of meaning. It was a dynamic that numerous observers described as both deeply romantic and profoundly destructive. The films they made together varied in quality, but consistently drew audiences eager to see the famous passion translated to screen. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, released in 1966, offered a portrait of marital warfare so vicious that many assumed it was autobiographical. Taylor won her second Academy Award for the role, disappearing into the character of Martha, overweight, aging, venomous, desperate. It was a performance that required her to become everything Hollywood had taught her to avoid appearing. She embraced it fully. By the early 1970s, the marriage was disintegrating under the accumulated weight of alcohol, infidelity, and exhaustion. Burton conducted affairs that Taylor discovered. Taylor conducted her own, that Burton tolerated or didn't. The fighting escalated. The reconciliations grew shorter. In 1974, they divorced in Switzerland, the proceedings handled with the efficiency that wealth provides. The following year, inexplicably to outside observers, they married again. The second marriage lasted less than a year. The end of Burton left Taylor unmoored in ways that previous divorces had not. She was in her mid-40s, her beauty transformed by time and excess into something still striking, but no longer transcendent. The roles available to her were diminishing. The public that had followed her scandals was aging alongside her, and younger audiences felt no particular connection to dramas of the previous decade. For the first time since childhood, Elizabeth Taylor faced the possibility of irrelevance. What followed were years of drift and desperate reinvention. A sixth marriage, to John Warner, the Virginia politician, seemed to promise a different kind of life entirely. She campaigned for his Senate bid, hosting events in Washington, attempting to transform herself into a political wife. The attempt was unsuccessful in every way that mattered. She gained significant weight, later attributing it to boredom and unhappiness. The marriage ended in 1982, and she found herself alone again. The house on Nimes Road entered her life during this interval of uncertainty. She had seen numerous properties in Bel Air and Beverly Hills, estates far grander than the single-story ranch behind Yellow Roses. But something in this particular house appealed to her. Perhaps its modesty by industry standards, perhaps its seclusion, perhaps simply the intuition that she would need a place designed for privacy rather than performance. She purchased it in 1981 and began the process of making it her own. The decoration reflected sensibilities accumulated over decades of wealth and travel. She favored rich colors, purples and deep reds that complemented her famous eyes. Artwork covered the walls, much of it collected during the Burton years. The closets were engineered to accommodate a wardrobe that numbered in the thousands of pieces, organized by designer, by occasion, by era. The jewelry required its own security arrangements, a vault installed to protect pieces whose combined value exceeded most real estate portfolios. She was creating not merely a home, but a repository, a physical archive of a life lived in spectacular excess. But the body that moved through these carefully designed rooms was increasingly compromised. The weight gained during the Warner marriage proved difficult to lose. The back pain that had plagued her for decades was now constant, managed through medications whose dosages steadily increased. She was drinking heavily, though the extent remained hidden from all but her closest associates. The woman who had once embodied physical perfection was disappearing into a body she no longer recognized or controlled. The intervention came in 1983. Family members and close friends confronted her with evidence of her addiction: the pills, the alcohol, the increasingly erratic behavior. Taylor resisted initially, then capitulated. She checked into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, becoming one of the facility's most famous patients, and in doing so, helping to destigmatize addiction treatment for countless others who followed. The admission was made public, a calculated decision that transformed private struggle into public narrative. What she encountered at Betty Ford challenged the structures that had governed her existence since childhood. The facility treated all patients equally. No special accommodations, no entourage, no deference to celebrity. She made her own bed. She participated in group therapy, alongside individuals whose names would never appear in newspapers. She confronted patterns of dependency that extended far beyond substances: the need for male validation, the inability to exist without romantic attachment, the terror of being alone. For perhaps the first time since the age of 9, Elizabeth Taylor was not the most important person in any room she entered. She completed treatment and returned to Nimes Road with intentions of sustained sobriety. The intentions proved difficult to maintain. Within months, the patterns had reasserted themselves, though in modified form. The drinking resumed, then escalated. The pain medications accumulated. By 1988, she was back at Betty Ford, checking in for a second stay that would last longer than the first. It was during this second treatment that she encountered Larry Fortensky. He was a construction worker, a teamster, 20 years her junior, with a history of substance abuse that had brought him to the same facility. Their connection defied every expectation associated with Elizabeth Taylor's romantic history. He was not wealthy. He was not famous. He was not sophisticated in any way that Hollywood recognized. He was, by most accounts, a decent and uncomplicated man who happened to be present when she was stripped of all the apparatus that usually surrounded her. The relationship that developed was both genuine and improbable. After treatment, they continued seeing each other, the world's most famous woman dating a man who drove a pickup truck and lived in a modest house in the Inland Empire. The press initially treated it as curiosity, then as comedy, then as evidence of Taylor's continuing capacity to confound expectation. She was defiant in response. Love, she insisted, was not a matter of categories or credentials. Larry made her happy. Larry kept her grounded. Larry did not want anything from her except herself. They married in 1991 at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, a venue that captured something essential about the strangeness of celebrity in late-century America. The guest list mixed Hollywood royalty with figures from entirely different worlds. Taylor wore a yellow Valentino gown. Fortensky wore the expression of a man who had wandered into someone else's dream and was attempting to behave appropriately. The marriage was her 8th. She had announced it would be her last. The early years at Nimes Road with Fortensky were, by the accounts available, relatively peaceful. He moved into the house and attempted to adapt to its rhythms. The staff, the security, the constant presence of Taylor's professional obligations. She was no longer making films with regularity, but her life remained intensely managed. The AIDS activism that had become her primary public cause, the fragrance empire that bore her name, the appearances and tributes that celebrity required. Fortensky existed alongside these activities without fully participating in them. But the marriage that had seemed to promise stability gradually revealed its limitations. They came from different worlds, and the difference could not be bridged by affection alone. He missed the life he had known before her, the simplicity, the anonymity, the ordinary pleasures unavailable to anyone connected to Elizabeth Taylor. She remained, despite everything, a creature of Hollywood, unable or unwilling to relinquish the rhythms of fame. The fights began. The separations occurred, quiet at first, then acknowledged. By 1996, they had divorced. She was alone again in the house on Nimes Road. But alone meant something different at 64 than it had at 24 or 44. The prospects of another marriage, another reinvention through romantic attachment, had diminished. The body was failing more rapidly now, the catalogue of ailments growing longer with each passing year. The AIDS work had begun in the mid-1980s, when the disease was still understood primarily as a gay plague, something respectable Hollywood preferred to ignore. Rock Hudson's death in 1985 had catalyzed her involvement. Hudson had been a friend, a co-star, a man she had kissed on screen, when such kisses meant something different than they would come to mean. His death from a disease that many Americans considered shameful awakened something in Taylor that transcended her usual causes. She became, improbably, one of the most effective advocates the AIDS community would ever have. The work was genuine and consequential. She co-founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, lending her name and her considerable fundraising abilities to an organization that would channel millions toward treatment and prevention. She testified before Congress, facing legislators who would rather the epidemic remain unmentioned. She visited patients in hospitals, holding hands that others refused to touch, demonstrating through physical contact that the disease was not transmitted by compassion. In an era when AIDS activists were fighting for basic acknowledgement, Elizabeth Taylor's involvement represented something invaluable: mainstream legitimacy. But the activism existed alongside continuing physical deterioration. The hip replacement in 1994 required months of rehabilitation. The fall at Nimes Road in 1995, she tripped over one of her dogs, resulted in a fractured vertebra that added new dimensions to her chronic pain. The brain tumor discovered in 1997, benign but requiring surgery, left her with temporary cognitive effects that frightened those close to her. Each medical crisis brought new medications, new dependencies, new negotiations, with a body that seemed determined to fail. The house adapted to accommodate her declining mobility. Wheelchair ramps appeared where steps had been. Handrails were installed in bathrooms. The staff expanded to include nursing personnel capable of managing complex medication regimens. The master bedroom was reconfigured around a hospital bed that could be adjusted for comfort, its clinical appearance softened by the expensive linens and decorative touches that Taylor insisted upon. She remained, even in illness, attentive to aesthetics. The decline would be managed, but it would be managed beautifully. Her perfume empire provided financial security during these years. White Diamonds, launched in 1991, became one of the best-selling celebrity fragrances in history, generating revenues that exceeded her film earnings. Additional scents followed: Passion, Black Pearls, Violet Eyes, each bearing her name and, on the packaging, images from her earlier incarnations. The business required minimal active involvement. Her name and likeness did the work while she received the royalties. It was, in its way, a form of passive income, derived from the accumulated capital of decades of fame. But fame itself was transforming into something more memorial than active. The tributes accumulated: lifetime achievement awards, retrospective screenings, honorary recognitions that celebrated a career effectively concluded. She attended when health permitted, appearing in wheelchairs or on the arms of assistants, the famous face now swollen by medications, the body wrapped in elaborate gowns designed to obscure its condition. The appearances became performances of survival, demonstrations that Elizabeth Taylor still existed, still mattered, still commanded attention, even as the attention had shifted to younger objects. The visitors to Nimes Road during these years described an atmosphere suspended between museum and sickroom. The artwork remained on the walls, the jewelry in its vault, the photographs documenting decades of extraordinary life arranged throughout the rooms. But the woman who had lived that life was increasingly confined to limited spaces within the house, the bedroom primarily, and a sitting room where she received guests. The gardens she had once walked were now viewed through windows. The pool she had once swum in remained maintained, but unused. The medication structured her days with pharmaceutical precision: morning pills, afternoon pills, evening pills, pain management, cardiac support, sleep aids, anti-anxiety medications, and others whose purposes were known only to her doctors. The regimen required careful coordination. Interactions between drugs posed constant risks. Nurses monitored dosages and timing. The woman who had twice sought treatment for addiction now existed in a state of medically sanctioned dependency, the distinction between necessary and excessive increasingly blurred. She remained capable of flashes of her former self. Visitors who expected to find a diminished invalid sometimes encountered instead the sharp wit and imperious manner that had always characterized her. She could still command a room, still deliver a line with perfect timing, still make clear that she was Elizabeth Taylor and would be treated accordingly. The spirit persisted, even as the body failed. But the intervals between such demonstrations grew longer, the energy required for performance harder to summon. Michael Jackson was a frequent presence during these years. Their friendship, which had begun in the 1980s, deepened as both became increasingly isolated from the world that had created them. They understood each other in ways that others could not: the peculiar damage of child stardom, the impossibility of normal human connection, the fortress of fame that protected and imprisoned simultaneously. He visited Nimes Road regularly. She defended him publicly when allegations arose. They were, in some sense, the same person in different bodies. His death in June 2009 devastated her in ways that surprised even those closest to her. She had outlived husbands, outlived parents, outlived co-stars and rivals, and friends beyond counting. But Michael's death, sudden, pharmaceutical, laden with the same complexities of dependency and isolation that defined her own existence, affected her differently. She was too ill to attend his memorial service, watching instead from the house on Nimes Road, surrounded by staff who did not fully understand what she had lost. A statement released to the press spoke of her heart, her sorrow, her sense of incomprehensible tragedy. The private grief was less articulate and more profound. The final years contracted around her. The world outside Nimes Road continued its accelerations, new technologies, new celebrities, new scandals that made her own seem almost quaint by comparison. She existed increasingly outside of time, a figure from an era that younger generations knew only through retrospectives and clip reels. The violet eyes that had once stopped traffic now looked out at a world transformed beyond recognition. She had lived long enough to become history while still breathing. Her children visited with varying frequency. Michael and Christopher, her sons from the Wilding marriage, maintained closer contact than Liza, her daughter with Mike Todd, or Maria, the daughter she had adopted during her marriage to Burton. The family dynamics, never simple, had grown more complicated over decades of remarriage and upheaval. Each child had negotiated their own relationship with their mother's fame, their own accommodations with her absences and excesses. Now, as her health declined, they faced the prospect of her mortality, a prospect that the world had been contemplating publicly for years, but that remained for them painfully personal. The grandchildren represented a different kind of connection. She had 10 of them by the end, ranging in age from young adults to children. They knew her primarily as an elderly woman in a wheelchair, a grandmother whose house contained treasures and whose history contained stories they only partially understood. For them, she was not the scandal of Cleopatra or the passion of Burton. She was simply their grandmother, frail and formidable, dispensing gifts and opinions with equal generosity. The jewelry, that legendary collection accumulated across decades and marriages, became a subject of increasing interest as her mortality approached. Auction houses made discreet inquiries. Appraisers offered their services. The collection represented not merely monetary value, but documented history. Each piece connected to a film, a husband, an era, a version of Elizabeth Taylor that existed now only in memory and celluloid. She showed no interest in dispersing it during her lifetime. The diamonds and emeralds and pearls remained in the vault at Nimes Road, waiting. Her final public appearance occurred in October 2010 at a Beverly Hills hotel for an AIDS benefit she had helped organize. She arrived in a wheelchair, her face puffy from medications, her body wrapped in a caftan of royal purple. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. She spoke briefly, her voice still carrying the distinctive cadence that audiences had known for 70 years. It was, though no one acknowledged it explicitly, a farewell performance. She would not appear in public again. The winter of 2010 brought renewed cardiac concerns. The congestive heart failure that had been managed for years was progressing beyond management. Fluid accumulated in her lungs, requiring procedures to drain it. Her breathing grew labored. The decision was made, sometime in January or February, that further aggressive intervention was unlikely to extend her life meaningfully. The focus shifted to comfort, to palliation, to the orchestration of a death that would be as managed as her life had been. She entered Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in early February 2011. The admission was described as routine, a precautionary measure related to ongoing cardiac symptoms. In reality, those close to her understood that she was unlikely to return to Nimes Road. The house that had sheltered her for 30 years would wait empty while she died in a hospital room, surrounded by machines monitoring the vital signs that remained vital in diminishing measure. The weeks at Cedars-Sinai passed in a rhythm of decline and temporary stabilization. Her children gathered, maintaining a presence that shifted as work and family obligations required. Visitors came when permitted, old friends, former colleagues, representatives of the causes she had championed. She remained conscious through most of it, aware of what was happening, participating in decisions about her own death with characteristic directness. There would be no extraordinary measures. There would be dignity, or as much dignity as modern dying permits. The night of March 22nd arrived with the particular stillness that hospital corridors acquire after visiting hours end. Her children were present, arranged around the bed in configurations they had negotiated among themselves. The monitors displayed their diminishing measurements. Her breathing had grown shallow, irregular, marked by pauses that lengthened as the hours passed. The body that had been photographed more than perhaps any other in the 20th century was completing its final performance without cameras, without audience, without the apparatus of fame that had attended every other significant moment of her existence. She died at 1:28 in the morning on March 23, 2011. The cause was listed as congestive heart failure, the proximate mechanism of a death that had been approaching for years through accumulated damage and chronic illness. She was 79 years old. The hospital released a statement within hours, drafted with the careful language that celebrity death requires. The family requested privacy. The world, predictably, declined to grant it. The funeral, held 5 days later at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, began 15 minutes late at her prior instruction. She had specified that she wanted to be late to her own funeral, a final gesture of the imperious wit that had characterized her throughout her life. The guest list mixed industry figures with AIDS activists, former co-stars with household staff. The service was private, closed to the press that gathered outside the gates. She was buried near her parents, in a mausoleum whose location was not disclosed to the public. The estate required months to settle. The jewelry collection, auctioned by Christie's that December, brought nearly $116 million, a record for a private collection. The white diamonds, the Taylor-Burton diamond, the Krupp, the La Peregrina. Each piece crossed the auction block and dispersed into new hands, the collection that had taken decades to assemble, scattered in a single evening. The proceeds benefited her AIDS Foundation and her heirs according to formulas specified in documents prepared years earlier. The house on Nimes Road sold in 2012 for slightly under $11 million. The new owners undertook renovations, removing the medical modifications, updating the systems, erasing the physical evidence of her final years. The yellow roses reportedly remained, climbing the walls as they had for decades, indifferent to the change in ownership. The address that had sheltered her longer than any other passed into other lives, other stories, other histories. What remains is footage and photographs, jewelry dispersed among collectors, fragrances still sold in department stores, films preserved and restored and streamed to audiences who know her name without knowing her era. The marriages have become statistics, the scandals historical footnotes, the beauty a matter of archival record rather than living presence. The woman who lived at 700 Nimes Road for 30 years